I'm Robert Sterling, 76 years old, and until recently I thought I understood my life and my place in it. I've spent every one of my years in a small town in upstate New York where the seasons rule your days and the neighbors know more about you than you might like. I was a mechanic all my life, and even now, my hands look like they've been carved out of old wood, scarred, cracked, a bit crooked in places. I used to say you could tell a man's story by looking at his hands. Mine spoke of years bent over engines, of grease under the nails, of bolts stubbornly refusing to turn until I made them. They also spoke of holding my boy, Michael, when he was small enough to fit between my forearms. Since my wife, Linda, passed away 5 years ago, my world has gotten quieter. Too quiet sometimes. I keep my house tidy, make my own coffee just the way she liked it. 3 scoops, not 2, and I spend most mornings in my garage tinkering with whatever I can get my hands on. Afternoons are for crosswords and old westerns, and evenings are for watching the world fade into dark through my front window. The highlight of my month is when Michael, his wife Sarah, and my 2 grandkids, Emma and Sam, visit. Their laughter fills the house in a way nothing else can. That's why, when Michael called me last Tuesday evening, I didn't expect anything unusual. We've had our regular calls for years, sometimes just small talk, sometimes more. I picked up the phone, and right away I felt something was off. His voice was tight, clipped. I asked if everything was okay, thinking maybe work was getting to him again. And then, without much of a pause, he said it. Words I still can't believe came out of his mouth. Dad, everything's a mess. And honestly, your constant questions aren't helping. I need some space. You're not welcome here right now. That's what he said. Just like that. Like he was reading from a script he didn't want to, but had convinced himself he had to. The words didn't sound like, "My son." They sounded like a door slamming shut on something I thought was unshakable. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask what he meant by not welcome. My throat closed up before I could. I just said, "All right," and hung up the phone. The silence in the room after that felt heavier than I've ever known. It wasn't the kind of silence you get when the power goes out. It was the kind that settles into your bones and tells you something's gone wrong in a way you can't fix with a wrench. The next morning, I didn't go into the garage. I didn't even make coffee. The paper stayed on the porch. My body felt slow, heavy, like someone had put weights in my pockets overnight. The words, "You're not welcome," kept looping in my head. And with every loop, they cut a little deeper. I'd been through loss before. Burying Linda was proof enough of that. But this was different. This wasn't death. This was rejection. The days blurred. I ignored the phone when it rang, even when the caller ID said, "Michael." I didn't want to hear his voice, not out of anger, but because I didn't think I could take another blow. The TV stayed off. I ate toast because it was the easiest thing to make. I slept in my recliner instead of my bed because getting up the stairs felt like more than I could handle. In a week, I'd managed to shrink my world to the size of my living room. And then, exactly 7 days later, the phone rang again. I almost didn't get up to answer it, but the sound kept echoing through the house, pulling me toward it. I saw Michael's name flash on the screen, and my hand hovered over the receiver. I could feel my heartbeat in my palm. Every part of me said, "Don't do it," but I picked it up anyway. When I finally brought the receiver to my ear, I didn't say anything right away. There was just breathing on the other end, uneven, shaky. Then I heard Michael's voice, but it wasn't the same voice from last week. It was smaller somehow, frayed at the edges. "Dad," he started, and then stopped, like the word itself had caught in his throat. I could hear what sounded like him wiping his face, a wet sniff, a muffled exhale. "I'm sorry," he finally said. 2 words, heavy enough to crack the ice I'd wrapped around myself these last 7 days. But the crack was small, and my guard was still up. I leaned back in the chair, my fingers tight around the phone, waiting for him to say more. He did. It came out in bursts, like he was trying to hold himself together but couldn't quite manage it. I messed up, Dad. I shouldn't have said what I said. Things have been bad here. It's been awful. Sarah and we've been fighting a lot. His voice broke again. I closed my eyes and pressed the phone harder against my ear, as if that would make the words make more sense. But they didn't, not entirely. There was truth in what he was saying. I could hear it, but there was also a shadow of something else. Something I wasn't sure I wanted to look at too closely yet. I stayed, quiet, letting him fill the space. He went on about deadlines, bills piling up, the kids having trouble at school. I could tell he was building a wall of reasons, maybe to keep himself from having to face what he'd really done. I understood that instinct more than I cared to admit, but all the while, the sentence from last week kept creeping in between his words. You're not welcome here right now. I wanted to tell him how deep it had cut, how it had made me feel like I'd been erased from his life in a single moment, but my voice wasn't ready for that yet. Finally, I said, Michael, do you know what those words did to me? There was a pause on his end, long enough that I wondered if the line had gone dead. Then he whispered, I do now. I've been thinking about it every day since. I believed him, at least partly. I could hear the exhaustion in his tone, the way guilt had been gnawing at him. But forgiveness doesn't just happen because someone says they're sorry. It takes more than that. It takes time, and sometimes it takes something else, something you can't quite name until it's in front of you. He asked if he could come by, said he didn't want to talk over the phone anymore. My first instinct was to say no. I wasn't ready to see his face, to read whatever was in his eyes, but something inside me, maybe the same thing that had made me pick up the phone, said, let him come. So I told him, all right, tomorrow, noon. And then I hung up before either of us could say anything else. That night, I sat in the recliner and stared at the blank TV screen. The reflection looking back at me seemed older than it had a week ago. There was a heaviness in my shoulders I couldn't shake, and my chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with my heart or my lungs. I thought about what I might say to him, how I could explain the hurt in a way that didn't sound like an attack, but still made him understand. I thought about Linda and how she would have handled it, probably with more grace than I could manage. The morning came slow. I made coffee for the first time in a week, but it didn't taste right. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until noon like I was waiting for a verdict. I even swept the kitchen floor, though I'm not sure why. It's not like Michael would notice. Maybe it was just a way to keep my hands busy, to keep from thinking too much. By the time I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, my palms were damp, and my stomach was tight enough to make me feel a little sick. When he stepped out of the car, I barely recognized him. His shoulders were hunched forward, his eyes red, his clothes wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in them. He walked toward the porch, slower than I'd ever seen him move, carrying something in his hands. From a distance, I couldn't tell what it was, but as he got closer, I saw it was a small cardboard box, and for some reason, that box made my chest ache in a way I wasn't ready for. Michael stopped at the first step of the porch, as if he needed permission to take the next one. The cold morning wind pushed his hair down across his forehead, and he didn't bother brushing it back. He stood there, clutching that box to his chest, looking at me with a mix of shame and fear. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice so low it almost got lost in the rustle of dry leaves in the yard. I made a small motion with my hand, not warm, but enough to let him pass. He walked in slowly, his eyes scanning the room like it was a stranger's house, even though he'd grown up here. I closed the door behind him, and the silence that settled in felt heavier than the entire week we'd spent not speaking. He held the box like it was fragile, but there was something in the way he carried it that told me the weight wasn't physical. He set it on the kitchen table and pulled out a chair, but waited until I sat down to take his seat. I sat across from him, my eyes fixed on the box, trying to guess what was inside. For a moment, neither of us said a word. It was like we were both measuring the distance between us, deciding whether it was worth trying to cross. He was the one who broke the silence. "I found these when I was cleaning out the garage," he said, lifting the lid. Inside were old photographs, some yellowed at the edges, and a stack of letters folded neatly. I recognized my handwriting on the very first ones he pulled out. They were letters I had written to Linda in our early years of marriage, and a few to him when he was in college, back when he'd been lost and unsure of his path. My handwriting looked strong and slanted, full of words I barely remembered putting on paper. I picked one up, and for a moment I was back in another time. I remembered what it felt like to write to him, trying to send strength and guidance from miles away, hoping my words would be a shelter when he needed one. Now those same words were sitting between us in a conversation we didn't quite know how to start. He took a deep breath and said, "I read them all this week, every single one, and I kept thinking, how did I forget who you are to me?" Those words hit hard, but not enough to bring the wall down entirely. I wanted to believe him, but part of me still felt the raw wound from 7 days ago. "You didn't just forget, Michael," I said slowly, choosing each word like it had weight. "You threw it away, and you told me I wasn't welcome." He lowered his head, his shoulders slumping like he'd expected the weight of my words, but they still hurt to carry. For a few minutes, we sifted through the photos. I saw him as a little boy sitting on the hood of a car I'd just fixed, grinning with all his crooked teeth. I saw Linda holding Emma when she was just a baby, and I remembered the last time she'd held Michael in her arms, a grown man by then, crying at his grandfather's funeral. The memories came like waves, some gentle, others too heavy to stay for long. I realized what I felt wasn't just anger, it was fear. Fear that the bond between us might be broken for good. When I looked up at him, I saw something I didn't expect. Not just regret, but a silent plea for help. "Dad, I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice almost breaking. I sighed and leaned forward. "It starts with showing up," I told him. "And you did that today, but the rest, that's going to take more than one visit." He nodded, as if he understood this was both an invitation and a warning. I stood and went to the cupboard, taking down 2 mugs. "Coffee?" I asked without looking at him. "Yeah, coffee would be good," he said. It was in that simple gesture, coffee served in my kitchen like so many times before, that I realized maybe today wasn't about fixing everything. Maybe it was just about opening the door again, even if only a crack. I poured the coffee slowly, the smell filling the kitchen like it always did on cold mornings. Michael wrapped his hands around the mug before I even sat back down, holding it like he was trying to warm something deeper than his fingers. For a while, we just sipped in silence. I could feel him searching for the right way to start, and I wasn't about to make it easier for him. I've learned over the years that if someone really wants to tell you the truth, you don't rush them. You let the quiet do the work. Finally, he put the mug down and leaned forward. "It wasn't just work," he said, his voice low. "I've been overwhelmed. Between the kids, the bills, and Sarah being on me about everything, I've been drowning, Dad. And instead of asking for help, I lashed out at you. You didn't deserve that." His words sounded honest, but I kept my face still. Part of me appreciated the apology, but another part still felt like there was more beneath the surface. I asked him what had really happened that day, the day he told me I wasn't welcome. He rubbed his face with both hands, like he was trying to wipe the memory away. "We had just had a huge fight, Sarah and me. The kids were yelling in the background, work was calling, and then you asked if I was okay. And I don't know why, but I snapped. I think I just needed to push someone away, and you were the closest target. It was stupid. I've regretted it every day since." I took a long sip of coffee, letting his words sink in. I believed the regret was real. I could see it in the way his eyes kept dropping to the table, as if he couldn't stand to meet mine for too long. But trust isn't built back with one conversation. It's a slow process, and right now, I wasn't sure we were even on the first step. "You can't take those words back, Michael," I said. Once they're out there, they live in a man's mind. And I've been living with them all week. His eyes filled, but he didn't cry. Instead, he nodded. I know. And I don't expect you to just forgive me. I want to earn my way back, if you'll let me. There was something in the way he said, earn, that caught my attention. It wasn't just an empty phrase. It sounded like he'd been thinking about it, maybe even planning for it. I didn't answer right away. I just studied him, the lines on his forehead deeper than I remembered, the gray creeping into his hair. My boy wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man who'd made a mistake big enough to leave a mark on both of us. I asked about the box of letters again. Why bring them here? He looked at it for a moment, then back at me, because I needed to remind myself of who you are and who I was before life got so damn loud. Those letters, Dad, they're not just words. They're proof that you've always been in my corner. I wanted you to know I haven't forgotten that. Not really. I just lost sight of it for a while. For a second, the air between us felt lighter. The letters weren't a peace offering in the usual sense. They weren't flowers or some last-minute gift from a gas station. They were pieces of our history, dug up and put in front of me as if to say, see, we were more than that phone call. I reached into the box and picked up a photo of him and Emma fixing a toy truck together in my garage. I remembered that day. He'd been patient with her, showing her how to turn the wrench, and she'd looked at him like he could do anything. I wondered if he remembered it the same way. Michael, I said, setting the photo down, showing up today is a start. But I need to see that you mean it. Not just today, not just because you feel guilty, but because you understand what you almost broke. He nodded again, slower this time, like the weight of my words had settled fully. I do, he said, and I'm ready to do the work. Michael stayed quiet after that, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug like he was buying time to figure out his next move. I could feel him watching me, maybe waiting for some sign that the worst had passed. But I wasn't ready to give that yet. I'd learned over a lifetime that forgiveness given too easily can lose its weight, and what happened last week deserved to carry some weight. Still, there was something in his posture, shoulders forward, head slightly bowed, that reminded me of when he was a kid about to admit to breaking something in the garage. Back then, the damage was a cracked headlight or a dent in a fender. Now it was something you couldn't fix with tools. I decided to ask him about Sarah. How's she holding up? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He rubbed the back of his neck before answering. She's tired, frustrated. We've both been on edge for months. The fights got worse after you and I stopped talking. She said it felt like I cut off a part of myself, and she was right. I didn't realize how much having you around kept me grounded. That admission landed heavy, not because it flattered me, but because it meant he'd known all along that pushing me away wasn't just hurting me. It was hurting him too. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Michael, when you told me I wasn't welcome, I believed you. I believed it so much that I started acting like it was the truth. I shut myself off, didn't even open the garage for a week. You know what that's like for me? That's like telling a bird not to fly. My voice came out rougher than I'd intended, but I didn't take it back. If this conversation was going to mean anything, he had to understand exactly what those words had done. He swallowed hard and nodded. I know, and I hate that I made you feel that way. I've been thinking about how I could fix it, but I know words aren't enough. His gaze flicked to the box again. That's why I brought these. I thought maybe we could go through them together. Not all at once, but over time. Rebuild things the way they were built in the first place. Slowly. That idea caught me off guard. I'd been expecting a quick apology, maybe a hug, and then he'd be out the door. But this sounded like he was ready to put in real work. For the first time. That day, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faintest opening, like a door I'd locked was testing its hinges. Going through them together, I repeated. That's not a bad idea. I reached for another letter in the box, one I'd written to him the year he left for college. I read a few lines silently, remembering how I'd chosen each word carefully back then, knowing he was stepping into a bigger world that wouldn't always be kind. Looking up, I caught him watching me like he was trying to see if the words still held the same meaning for me now. "They still matter," I said, folding the letter and setting it aside. "But if we're going to do this, it's not just about remembering the good. We have to talk about the bad too, even the ugly stuff." He didn't flinch. "I'm ready," he said. And for a second, I believed him. I could see it in his eyes, a mix of fear and determination, the kind you get when you know the road ahead is long but worth walking. I stood up and walked to the sink, rinsing out my mug, giving myself a moment to breathe. Sometimes you need to move, even if it's just to shake the weight of the conversation off your shoulders for a second. "All right," I said finally, turning back to him. "We'll start small. You come by next Sunday. We'll have coffee, go through a few letters. No pressure, no pretending, just honesty." He nodded, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen in a long time. Relief. When he left an hour later, I stood by the window and watched him drive off. The driveway felt different, like it had carried both the heaviest and lightest steps I'd seen in years. I didn't know if we'd get all the way back to where we'd been before, but for the first time in a week, I wasn't thinking about the words "you're not welcome." I was thinking about next Sunday, and that felt like a start. The week passed slower than I expected. Every day I found myself glancing at the clock around the same time Michael had arrived before, half expecting to see his car in the driveway. I kept busy in small ways, fixing the loose hinge on the back door, organizing my tools in the garage, even wiping down the old radio on the workbench that hadn't been touched in months. But beneath it all was this quiet hum of anticipation, the kind that feels a lot like nerves. I told myself I was just curious about how Sunday would go, but the truth was, I cared more than I wanted to admit. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, I'd already been up for hours. I made coffee, not just for myself but enough for two, and set out a plate of oatmeal cookies I'd baked the night before. It wasn't much, but I figured it was a gesture, a way to say without words that I was open to him being here. Around 11:45, I found myself standing near the window, watching the road like a man waiting for the mail. When I saw his car turn in, my chest tightened. This was the moment I'd been thinking about all week, and suddenly I wasn't sure how ready I was. Michael got out carrying the same box of letters. That alone told me he hadn't forgotten the plan. This time, he walked to the porch a little faster, still cautious, but with a bit more steadiness in his step. I opened the door before he knocked, and we exchanged a simple morning. No hugs, no handshakes, just enough to acknowledge that he was welcome without making it ceremonial. We went straight to the kitchen, where the coffee was still hot. We started with small talk, how Emma was doing in school, how Sam had joined a soccer team. It felt almost normal, though there was still an invisible thread pulling both of us back to the reason we were here. After a while, Michael reached into the box and pulled out one of the older letters. "This one's from when you were teaching me how to change the oil on the Chevy," he said, smiling faintly. I took it from him and remembered that summer clearly. The smell of motor oil, the way his hands were too small for a wrench, and how proud he'd been when we finished the job without spilling a drop. Reading the letter out loud, I could hear my younger self in the words, patient, encouraging, quietly proud. Michael listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the page as though he were seeing those moments for the first time. When I finished, he said quietly, "You were always patient with me, even when I didn't deserve it." That caught me off guard. I wanted to say it wasn't about deserving. It was about being his father, but I kept it to myself. Some truths don't need to be spoken every time. They just need to be felt. We went through 2 more letters, pausing after each to talk about the memories they stirred up. Some made us laugh, like the one about him accidentally painting the neighbor's fence blue instead of white. Others brought a lump to my throat, like the one I'd written after his mother passed, trying to explain grief in a way he could hold on to. Through it all, I noticed something changing, not just in him, but in me. The words, "You're not welcome," were fading, replaced by the echo of old moments that still had the power to bridge the gap between us. At one point, Michael looked up from a photograph of him and his mother and said, "I don't know how I got so far away from this." He didn't mean the picture. He meant the closeness we'd had. I didn't have an answer, but I knew the important thing was that he'd noticed. "The distance doesn't happen all at once," I said. "It's small steps, little choices. The same way you close it is how it opened, one step at a time." He nodded, and I could see that he understood. By the time he left that afternoon, there was still a lot unsaid between us, but the air felt different, less heavy, more open. He promised to come back next Sunday, same time, same plan. As I watched him drive away, I realized that this wasn't about getting back to how things used to be. It was about building something new, using the old as a foundation but not as a blueprint, and maybe that was better. The days leading up to the third Sunday felt different from the week before. I wasn't just waiting for Michael to show up, I was preparing for it, both in my mind and in my home. I fixed the loose cabinet door in the kitchen, swept out the garage, and even set up the old card table in the living room so we'd have more space to spread out the letters and photos. It wasn't about making things perfect, it was about showing that I was making room for him again, literally and figuratively. But underneath all that, there was a quiet unease, a sense that the surface calm we'd been building might not hold forever. Sunday morning came with a light drizzle tapping against the windows. I brewed the coffee and made scrambled eggs, figuring we could use something warm with the weather the way it was. At exactly noon, I saw Michael's car pull in. This time he looked more composed, not cheerful exactly, but steadier. He walked in, carrying not just the box of letters, but a manila folder under his arm. I noticed it right away, and the way he held it told me whatever was inside wasn't going to be light conversation. We went through our routine, coffee, a little small talk, a letter or two from the box. But the whole time my eyes kept drifting to that folder on the table. Finally I asked, "What's in there?" Michael hesitated, looking at it like it might burn him if he touched it too long. "It's paperwork," he said, slowly. "Stuff I should have told you about months ago." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. I knew that tone. It was the same one he'd used when he called from college to say he'd flunked a class, or when he'd told me the first car he bought had broken down. Only this time, it was heavier. He opened the folder and slid a few pages toward me. They were notices from the bank, overdue mortgage statements, late payment warnings, even a letter about the possibility of foreclosure. I read them, without saying a word, the weight of each page settling in my chest. When I looked up, Michael's eyes were fixed on the table. "I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want you to see me like this," he said. "Like I've failed." I leaned back, taking a slow breath. "Michael, failing isn't about falling into a hole. It's about refusing to climb out of it. You should have told me sooner." My voice wasn't angry, but it was firm. He nodded quickly, as if he'd already told himself the same thing 100 times. "I know, and I think part of why I snapped at you that day was because I didn't want you anywhere near this mess. I thought if I pushed you away, I could handle it alone, but I can't." Hearing him say that hit me in two ways. Part of me wanted to tell him I'd help right then and there, but another part remembered the sting of those words, "You're not welcome." I wasn't going to jump in like nothing had happened. "If I'm going to help," I said slowly, "it has to be as part of something bigger. Fixing this and fixing us. One doesn't work without the other." His eyes met mine for the first time since he'd shown me the folder, and I saw a flicker of relief there, like he'd been bracing for me to turn him down completely. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about numbers, deadlines, and what steps he'd already tried. It wasn't a comfortable conversation, money rarely is, but it was real. By the time he left, We didn't have a solution yet, but we had a plan to start working on one. As I stood in the doorway watching him drive away, I realized something important. Sometimes repairing a relationship isn't just about apologies and memories. Sometimes it's about rolling up your sleeves and facing the hard stuff together. That night, I put the manila folder in the same box as the letters. It didn't belong there in the usual sense, but to me, it was now part of our story. Not a proud part, but a necessary one. The week after Michael showed me the folder was a restless one. I kept thinking about the numbers, the overdue notices, and the way he'd said he didn't want me to see him like he'd failed. But I also kept circling back to something quieter, something that stung in a different way. The possibility that I hadn't been as present as I thought I was. I'd always told myself I was there for him, that I called, asked questions, offered advice when I could. But maybe I'd been mistaking routine for connection. Maybe somewhere along the way, I'd stopped really listening. That thought sat heavy in the back of my mind as Sunday crept closer. When the day came, the weather was bright but cold, the kind of sharp autumn air that makes your breath visible. I'd gotten up early, not to cook or clean, but to sit in the garage for a while. Surrounded by tools and the faint smell of oil, I thought about all the times Michael had been in here with me, watching, learning, or just killing time. It occurred to me that we hadn't spent real time together like that in years. Most of our recent conversations had been on the phone, cut short by one of us needing to be somewhere. Maybe that's how the gap had widened, little by little, without either of us noticing until it was too wide to ignore. When Michael arrived, he looked more relaxed than the week before. He still brought the box, but this time he also carried a thermos. "Made coffee at home," he said, holding it out like a peace offering. I took it, poured us both a cup, and we sat at the kitchen table without rushing to open the box. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like we were working through a script. We were just sitting, two men with coffee, waiting to see where the conversation would go. I decided to go first. "I've been thinking this week," I said, my hands wrapped around the mug, "about how we got here. And I realized I've been telling myself I was doing my part just because I kept the routine going. Calls, visits, asking questions. But maybe I wasn't really hearing you. Maybe I was holding on to the idea of what our relationship used to be instead of paying attention to what it actually was." Michael looked at me for a long moment before answering. "That's a big thing to say, Dad." I shrugged. "It's the truth. I'm not saying I caused this, but I'm saying I might have let some of the cracks grow without noticing. I was so focused on keeping things familiar that I didn't realize you were drifting." He nodded slowly, his expression softer than I'd seen it in a while. "I guess I could have said something sooner too," he admitted. "I just didn't want to disappoint you. And the longer I stayed quiet, the harder it got." That hit me harder than I expected. The idea that my own son was afraid of letting me down, even as an adult, with a family of his own. We opened the box after that, but not in the usual way. Instead of picking letters at random, I handed him one I'd been thinking about all week. A short note I'd written when he was 14, after he'd failed his first driving test. It wasn't long, just a few lines telling him that failure didn't define him, that trying again mattered more. He read it in silence, then set it down. "You've been saying that my whole life," he said. "I guess I forgot it applies to more than just driving tests." We talked for hours that day, about the mortgage, about the kids, about how sometimes you don't even notice the walls going up until someone points them out. By the time the sun started setting, the coffee was gone and the box was still half full. But I didn't care. The letters weren't the point anymore. The point was that we were having the kind of conversation we hadn't had in years, open, honest, and without a clock ticking in the background. When he left, I didn't stand at the window this time. Instead, I went back to the garage, sat at the workbench, and thought about how much easier it is to repair a car when you catch the problem early. With people, it's harder, but maybe, just maybe, we'd caught this in time. The fifth Sunday started before sunrise for me. I couldn't sleep, so I got up and puttered around the house, making coffee and reading the paper without really seeing the words. The air outside was crisp, the kind that wakes you up the second you step into it, and I found myself standing on the porch longer than usual. I wasn't just waiting this time, I was wondering what kind of day we'd have. We'd been moving in the right direction. Sure, but I knew trust didn't rebuild in a straight line. There are always bumps, maybe even setbacks. When Michael's car pulled in, I noticed right away there was no box in his hands. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd forgotten it or decided to skip our ritual. But then he got out, walked around to the passenger side, and pulled out something I hadn't expected, a small wooden toolbox. It wasn't new. In fact, it looked a little worn, like it had seen years of work. When he stepped up to the porch, he handed it to me without saying anything. I opened it, and inside were my old wrenches, sockets, and screwdrivers, the set I'd given him when he moved out years ago. "I've kept these in my garage all this time," he said, his voice steady but low. "I didn't use them as much as I should have, but I never got rid of them. I thought maybe we could put them back to work together." I stood there holding the box, running my fingers over the familiar metal handles, feeling the weight of more than just tools. This wasn't about fixing cars, it was about him handing back a piece of our history, an unspoken promise that he wanted to make time for the things we used to share. We spent the first hour in the garage that day. I pulled the cover off an old lawnmower that hadn't run in years, and we worked side by side like we used to. There wasn't much talking at first, just the clink of tools and the occasional curse when a bolt didn't budge. But the silence felt different now. Comfortable, like we were speaking in a language that didn't need words. I caught him watching me a couple of times, the way you watch someone to see if you're doing it right, and each time I just nodded, letting him know he was. After we got the mower running, we went inside for coffee. That's when he told me he'd spoken to the bank during the week and arranged a meeting to discuss his options. "I didn't want to come here today without telling you I'd taken a step," he said. "I don't want you to feel like I'm just dumping my problems in your lap." That mattered to me more than I think he realized. It wasn't about whether I could help financially, it was about seeing him take ownership of the mess. I told him I was proud of him for making the call, and I meant it. He shrugged, but I could see the way his shoulders relaxed a little, like the words had taken some weight off him. We spent the rest of the afternoon in the kitchen, going through a couple of letters and laughing over an old photo of him wearing a cowboy hat at age 6, looking like he owned the world. There were still pauses, still moments where we both hesitated before speaking, but the edges weren't as sharp anymore. When he left that evening, he didn't just wave from the driveway. He walked back up to the porch, looked me in the eye, and said, "Thanks for letting me back in." It was simple, but it landed deep. I just nodded and told him, "Keep showing up," because that's what it came down to now. Not grand gestures, but consistency. After he drove away, I carried the wooden toolbox back into the garage and set it on the workbench. I left it open, the tools neatly lined up, ready for the next time. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to break between us. I felt like we were building again. The sixth Sunday began like the others. Coffee brewing, a light breakfast, the quiet hum of anticipation in the air. But just before noon, I heard the sound of 2 car doors closing instead of one. I looked out the window and saw Michael stepping out of the driver's seat and Sarah getting out on the other side. It was the first time she'd been here since before all of this started. My stomach tightened, not out of anger, but because I knew this visit was going to carry its own weight. When they reached the porch, Sarah was the first to speak. "Morning, Robert," she said, her voice calm but careful. I could tell she'd thought about how she wanted to sound before she knocked. I nodded, stepped aside, and let them both in. Michael was carrying the wooden toolbox again, but it stayed in his hand as they followed me into the kitchen. Sarah looked around like she was taking inventory of a place she'd once been more familiar with, her eyes landing on the box of letters sitting on the table. We sat down, the three of us, and there was a moment of silence before Sarah started. Michael told me what happened, and I want to say I'm sorry for the way things have been, for the distance. We've both been stretched thin, and that doesn't excuse it, but it's the truth. Her voice wavered slightly on the last few words. I didn't interrupt her. Part of me wanted to say, "You didn't tell me I wasn't welcome," but another part knew that resentment would only push us backward. Michael picked up from there, explaining that he'd asked Sarah to come because he wanted us all to talk openly, not just in bits and pieces. "I know I started this rift, Dad, but it wasn't just between you and me. It affected her too. I don't want to rebuild half a bridge." I leaned back, crossing my arms, letting the words settle. There was truth in that. The space between us hadn't been just about me and him. It had rippled into the whole family. We talked about the fights they'd been having, the stress of balancing work, bills, and the kids. Sarah admitted that she'd sometimes avoided calling me because she didn't want to add to the noise. That stung, but it also made sense in a way I didn't like to admit. I told them both that I wasn't looking for perfection or constant visits. I just didn't want to be shut out. I needed to know that even if life got messy, I was still part of the picture. After a while, Michael got up, opened the toolbox and pulled out 2 wrenches. He handed one to me and one to Sarah. "Let's go to the garage," he said. It felt symbolic, not in some grand, rehearsed way, but in a quiet, practical one. We ended up tightening loose shelves, replacing a worn handle on the side door, and reorganizing a few drawers. It wasn't deep conversation, but it was teamwork, and that counted for something. When we came back inside, Sarah lingered near the table. She picked up one of the letters, read a few lines silently, and then looked at me. "You've always been good with words, Robert. I think Emma and Sam should read some of these." I nodded, realizing she was right. If the kids could see these parts of our history, maybe they'd understand the bond I'd always tried to keep alive. They left together that afternoon, and as I watched their car pull away, I felt something I hadn't in months. The sense that the walls between us weren't just coming down, but that the ground beneath was becoming solid again. For the first time, it felt like this wasn't just Michael showing up for me. It was the family starting to circle back. The 7th Sunday brought a different kind of energy before it even began. Around 11:30, I heard the unmistakable sound of children's voices outside, high-pitched and full of life. I stepped onto the porch and saw Michael's car pulling in, but this time the back doors opened first. Emma hopped out, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a bright yellow sweater that practically glowed against the grey sky. Sam followed, clutching a soccer ball under one arm, grinning like he already had a plan for the afternoon. Michael and Sarah climbed out after them, both looking more at ease than I'd seen in months. They came up the steps together, and Emma was the first to speak. "Grandpa, Dad said you have a garage with lots of tools. Can we see?" Her excitement was like a spark, and I couldn't help but smile. "We can do better than that," I told her. "We can use them." Sam's eyes lit up, and he tossed the soccer ball into the corner of the porch without a second thought. It was the first time in a long time that they'd come here not just for a visit, but to actually spend the day. Inside, I poured coffee for the adults and juice for the kids, the kitchen feeling fuller than it had in years. Michael set the wooden toolbox on the table, and Emma leaned over it like it was a treasure chest. "These are old," she said, running her fingers over a wrench. "Older than you," I told her with a wink, and she laughed like that was the funniest thing she'd heard all week. It wasn't about the tools. It was about the curiosity in her eyes, and the way she looked at me like I had something worth teaching. We headed out to the garage, and for the next hour I showed them how to tighten a bike chain, oil a squeaky hinge, and check the air in a tire. Sam kept asking if he could try everything himself, while Emma took her time, watching closely before making a move. Michael stood back for most of it, but every so often I caught him smiling. Not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from seeing something good happen right in front of you. After the garage, Sarah joined us in the kitchen, pulling out a batch of cookies she'd baked that morning. The smell filled the room, and the kids hovered like bees over honey until she gave them each one. As we sat around the table, the conversation flowed in a way that felt effortless. The kids asked about the letters, and I pulled out one that mentioned a fishing trip I'd taken with Michael when he was their age. They laughed at the part where he'd fallen into the water, and Michael shook his head, pretending to be embarrassed. It struck me. Then, this was the bridge we'd been building without realizing it. It wasn't just about mending things between me and Michael anymore. It was about creating moments the kids would carry with them, the kind that outlast arguments and bad weeks. They were seeing us work together, laugh together, and share pieces of the past without bitterness in the air. Before they left, Emma hugged me tight and whispered, "I like coming here." Sam gave me a high five that nearly knocked my glasses off. Michael didn't say much as they got into the car, but the way he looked at me said enough. There was a gratitude there that didn't need words, the kind that's built over time, visit by visit. When the driveway was empty again, I stood in the quiet house and realized something important. The wound from that phone call was still there, but it was healing in ways I hadn't expected. Some scars don't fade completely, but they can stop hurting. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they remind you of how strong you've become. The 8th Sunday morning felt unusually still. The sky was a pale, flat grey, the kind that makes everything quieter. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching the steam curl upward, thinking about how far we'd come in the last 2 months. Each Sunday had been a small step forward, and though the memory of that awful phone call still lingered, it no longer sat in the center of everything. At least that's how it felt. Until the sound of Michael's car in the driveway brought me back to the present. When he walked in, there was something different in his face. Not tense exactly, but heavy, like he was carrying a weight he didn't want to set down. He greeted me, set the toolbox on the counter out of habit, and sat at the table without taking off his jacket. I could tell right away that today's conversation wasn't going to start with small talk. "Dad," he began, his voice low, "I need to tell you something before you hear it from anyone else." That's never a sentence you want to hear. And my stomach tightened instantly. He took a deep breath and explained that the situation with the bank had gotten worse. The meeting he'd mentioned before hadn't gone the way he'd hoped, and foreclosure was now a real possibility. "I'm not here to ask for money," he said quickly, like he needed to make that clear before anything else. "But I might need a place to stay. For me, Sarah, and the kids, at least for a while." He kept his eyes on the table as he said it. Like looking at me might make it harder to get the words out. I leaned back, letting the request settle in. It wasn't just about space in the house, it was about the space in our relationship. We'd been rebuilding carefully, step by step, and now he was asking to collapse the distance entirely. A week here and there was one thing. Living under the same roof again, that was something else entirely. My mind flashed to the quiet routines I'd built since Linda passed, the freedom of my own space, and how all of that would change overnight. But then I thought about Emma's yellow sweater, Sam's laughter in the garage, and the way Michael had been showing up week after week, toolbox in hand. If I said no, would we slide back into the cold space we'd just started to leave behind? If I said yes, would it be too much? Too soon? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I got up, poured him a cup of coffee, and sat back down. "If we do this," I said slowly, "it's not just about giving you a roof. It's about respect. For my home, for the way I live, and for the work we've done to get here. Can you handle that?" Michael nodded without hesitation. "Yes, I know I can, and I want you to know I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice." His voice cracked a little on that last part, and I knew he meant it. He wasn't using this as a shortcut. He was swallowing his pride to keep his family safe, and that mattered. Still, I told him we'd need to set some ground rules, space for everyone, chores, And most importantly, no letting old habits creep back in. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking logistics, where they'd sleep, what to do with their remaining things, how long they might need to stay. It wasn't a light conversation, but it felt honest and necessary. By the time he left, there was a plan. In a week's time, my quiet house would be full again. I wasn't sure how I felt about that yet, but I knew one thing. The version of me from 2 months ago would have said no without thinking. The version sitting at that table today was willing to try. That night, I walked through the house, looking at each room like I was seeing it for the last time in its current state. The thought of sharing the space again brought a mix of nerves and something I hadn't expected, a flicker of anticipation. Maybe this was another step, not just in helping Michael through a crisis, but in seeing what kind of family we could be when life pushed us back under the same roof. They moved in on a Saturday, the kind of damp, chilly morning that makes furniture feel heavier than it really is. Michael arrived first with a rented trailer, followed by Sarah driving their car with the kids in the back. The moment they stepped inside, the house felt different, fuller, warmer, but also noisier in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Emma darted from room to room, announcing which one she liked best, while Sam parked himself in the living room with his soccer ball like it was his personal headquarters. Sarah carried in boxes labeled kitchen and bedroom, and Michael started unloading the trailer without saying much, focused on getting it done. I'd cleared the guest room for Michael and Sarah and set up the smaller bedroom for the kids. It wasn't much, but I'd made sure each had fresh bedding and enough space to unpack a little. Watching them settle in stirred something in me. A reminder of the years when the house was always full, when Linda's voice echoed through the hallways and the smell of dinner drew everyone to the table. Those memories were comforting, but they also carried a bittersweet edge. I knew this wouldn't be the same, and I didn't want to pretend it would be. By Sunday evening, the rhythm of the house had already shifted. The TV was on more often, there were shoes piled by the door, and the kitchen counter was never completely clear. None of it was bad, but it was different, and different takes adjusting to. I caught myself retreating to the garage more than usual, not because I wanted to avoid them, but because I needed a little quiet to keep my thoughts steady. Michael must have noticed, because one night he followed me out there, standing beside me as I tinkered with a toolbox drawer. "Too much noise?" he asked. I didn't deny it. "Just not used to it," I told him, and he nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. During the week, the kids became the bridge between all of us. Emma liked helping me in the kitchen, standing on a chair to stir pancake batter, while Sam was obsessed with checking the tire pressure on every bike in the garage. Michael split his time between job hunting, making calls to the bank, and helping me with small projects around the house. Sarah, to her credit, made a real effort to blend into the flow of my routines. She asked before rearranging anything, and always made sure the kids cleaned up after themselves. Still, there were moments when the air felt tense, like we were all aware this was a temporary arrangement and didn't know exactly how long temporary would last. One night after dinner, Michael and I sat at the table after everyone else had gone to bed. He told me he'd had a promising phone interview and might hear back soon. Then he paused, staring at his coffee cup, and said, "I know this isn't easy for you. Having us here, I want you to know I see that." I didn't say much in return, just nodded and told him, "Seeing it is the first step to not taking it for granted." It wasn't meant to be harsh, just honest. He didn't take it the wrong way. By Thursday, we'd had our first real test. Emma left her school backpack in the hallway, and I tripped over it on my way to the kitchen. I didn't get hurt, but my frustration flared before I could check it. My voice came out sharper than I intended, and Emma's face fell instantly. Michael stepped in, asking her to take it to her room, and the tension eased, but it lingered in my mind for the rest of the night. Living together meant every small thing had the potential to turn into something bigger if we didn't handle it right. Despite the occasional bumps, The week ended on a better note. Saturday afternoon, we all ended up in the backyard. Michael grilling burgers while the kids kicked a ball around. Sarah set the table on the porch, and I found myself watching them without feeling like an outsider in my own home. It wasn't perfect, but it was working, for now, and maybe that was enough. That night, as I locked up the garage, I realized something important. This was as much a test for me as it was for Michael. It wasn't just about whether he could live up to the trust I'd started to rebuild. It was about whether I could open my life wide enough to let his whole family in, without letting old wounds dictate every move. The second week under the same roof started with a rhythm that almost felt natural. Mornings were busy, Sarah getting the kids ready for school, Michael checking his email for job updates, and me making coffee strong enough to wake everyone up. We'd found a way to move around each other without stepping on toes too often, though there were still moments when the noise and constant activity felt like too much. But I'd also noticed something I hadn't expected. The house didn't feel as empty in the evenings, and that quiet I used to treasure so much now felt different. Not worse, just changed. By midweek, Michael got a call back from the company he'd interviewed with. He didn't get the job yet, but they wanted a second interview. That small win lifted the mood in the whole house. Sarah baked a pie to celebrate. Emma made a handmade good luck card, and Sam insisted on wearing one of Michael's ties around the house for practice. I didn't say much about it, but inside I felt a quiet pride. Not just in him for getting another chance, but in all of them for finding something to be hopeful about together. That Thursday night, after everyone had gone to bed, I was in the garage cleaning up when I heard the door open. Michael stepped in, hands in his pockets, and leaned against the workbench. "Can't sleep?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, I've been thinking about that phone call, the one that started all this." His voice was low, almost careful, like he was walking across thin ice. He went on to tell me that the moment he'd hung up on me that day, he'd felt something sink in his chest. He didn't know it then, but now he saw it clearly. That he'd been pushing away the one person who'd never walked away from him. "I was embarrassed," he admitted. "Embarrassed to be failing at work, at home, at everything. And I thought if I shut you out, I could control at least one part of the mess. But all I did was make it worse." I listened without interrupting, letting him lay it all out. When he finished, I said, "Michael, you can't undo words like that. They don't vanish just because you regret them, but you can prove them wrong, one day at a time." He nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting that answer. "I'm trying," he said. "I just want to know, do you believe me when I say I'm not that guy anymore?" That question hit me hard, because the truth was, I did believe him. But belief is different from forgetting. I told him as much. "I believe you, but I'm not going to erase what happened. I think the real test isn't whether you can convince me. It's whether you can convince yourself." He didn't argue. Instead, he stood there for a moment, looking around the garage like he was trying to memorize it, then said, "Thanks for not giving up on me." I just nodded and went back to wiping down the workbench, not because I didn't want to talk more, but because sometimes the best way to hold on to a moment is not to stretch it too thin. The next day, I noticed subtle shifts. Michael started taking the kids to school in the mornings so Sarah could have some time to herself. He began fixing small things around the house without me. Asking, a loose cabinet hinge, a squeaky floorboard. They were little things, but they mattered because they were proof of him showing up without being told to. It reminded me of the man I'd raised, the one who used to take pride in making himself useful. By the end of the week, I realized we'd crossed some invisible line. We were no longer just coexisting under the same roof. We were moving together, tackling small problems as a team, even laughing in the kitchen over burnt toast or the kids' messy homework. There were still things to work on, sure, but the air in the house no longer felt heavy with what had been said. It felt lighter, as if the words that had hurt so much had finally started to loosen their grip. The third week of living together brought the turning point I didn't realize I'd been waiting for. It was a Saturday morning, bright and cool, and I was in the garage replacing the spark plug on the mower when Michael came out with a grin that I hadn't seen in a long time. "I got the job," he said simply. No build-up, no hesitation, just those 4 words. For a second, I didn't move, letting them sink in. Then I put down the wrench and shook his hand, firm and steady. "Good," I said. "Now the real work begins." And I meant more than just the job. Sarah joined us in the garage a few minutes later, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She was smiling too, the kind of smile that comes when a weight's been lifted off your shoulders. "We'll be able to get back on track with the bank," she said, "and we can start planning our move back to our place." There was relief in her voice, but also a note of gratitude I didn't need her to put into words. I knew what this meant for them, and for me. That afternoon, we decided to celebrate in our own quiet way. Michael grilled burgers out back while I showed Emma how to sand a piece of scrap wood smooth enough to use as a shelf in her room. Sam ran around the yard with the soccer ball, calling for us to watch every kick. The air felt lighter, and for the first time since all of this began, I realized I wasn't bracing for the next problem to drop. I was just in the moment, and the moment was good. Later, after the kids were in bed, Michael and I sat in the kitchen. He told me that getting the job wasn't just about money. It was about proving to himself that he could come back from a low point without cutting people out. "I was wrong, Dad," he said, "about everything I said that day. I thought I needed space from you, but what I really needed was to be closer." There was no defensiveness in his tone, no need to justify, just the truth, plain and unpolished. I told him I'd never forget that phone call, but I also wouldn't let it define us. "We're more than our worst days," I said. "The fact that you're sitting here now, telling me this, is proof enough that you're not the man you were 3 months ago." He nodded, his eyes steady on mine. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no handshakes, no tears. But it was solid, the kind of exchange that stays with you because it's built on everything that came before. The next week, they began packing their things. The kids made me promise they could still come over to work in the garage and bake cookies, and I told them I'd hold them to it. Sarah hugged me before they left, longer than she ever had before, and said, "Thank you for giving us this time." Michael was the last to walk out the door. He paused, looked back at me and simply said, "You're always welcome." The words landed deep, the exact opposite of the ones that had started this whole mess. After they drove away, the house was quiet again. I walked through the rooms, noticing the absence of shoes by the door, the cleared-off counters, the stillness. It felt different from before, though. This wasn't the quiet of isolation. It was the quiet of a place that had been lived in, a place that had done its job as a home. The space between us now was no longer cold. It was a stretch, a road we'd already walked together and could cross again if needed. That night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with my coffee, I thought about the arc of it all. From the words that nearly ended our bond to the moments that rebuilt it. We hadn't erased the past, and we didn't need to. The strength was in carrying it forward without letting it break us. And as I rinsed out my cup and turned off the light, I realized something I hadn't been sure of for months. My son and I were on solid ground again, for good this time. Some wounds never fully disappear, but they change shape over time. What began with words that cut deep ended with actions that spoke louder than any apology could. I think that's the lesson I'll carry with me, that rebuilding trust isn't about erasing the hurt, but proving day after day that you're choosing each other again. If you've ever gone through something like this, you know it's not a straight road. There are moments when you wonder if the distance will ever close, and others when a single gesture can bring you closer than you've been in years. Maybe that's why I'm sharing this, because someone out there might be standing at the edge of that choice right now. Tell me if this reminds you of something you've lived. Share it with someone who might need a little hope that broken things can be repaired. And if you want to keep hearing real stories like this, stay with me. There's always another one worth telling. What about you? Who's the person in your life you'd open the door to, even after everything? Sometimes the answer to that question can change everything.